One, two, three, four.
Hello, you're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We are a general interest independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to close our store and cancel in-person events. But SKYLIT is your neighborhood bookstore, and we are finding ways to create community even while we're far apart. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out lots of new audio content to help you discover new books, connect with authors, and check in with your favorite booksellers. To learn more about how you can help keep SKYLIT alive, please visit our website at skylitebooks.com or check out our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy.
Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast, and I am your host, Kelsey Nolan. SKYLIT Books is an independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. We are open every day from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. for in-store browsing, curbside pickup, masked in-store browsing. And you can, of course, shop online at skylitebooks.com. And you're here for the podcast. We also have virtual events on our Crowdcast page, crowdcast.io/skylitebooks. And now on to the show. Joining us today are Ken Kwapis. Ken Kwapis is an award-winning director of motion pictures and television. He has directed 11 feature films, among them A Walk in the Woods, He's Just Not That Into You, and Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. His feature debut was Sesame Street Presents Follow That Bird, starring Jim Henson's Muppets. For television, Kwapis helped launch 9 series, including the Larry Sanders Show, The Bernie Mac Show, and The Office. Among his upcoming future projects is Sisterhood Everlasting, based on the final book in Anne Brashare's Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants series. But what I really want to do is direct is his first book that's available for purchase at SKYLIT Books. And joining him is David Ulin, who is the author or editor of a dozen books, including Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles, which was shortlisted for the I always have a hard time with this, Diamondstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. He's the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lannan Foundation, and Black Mountain Institute at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Former book critic of the Los Angeles Times, he's an associate professor of English at the University of Southern California and the book's editor of Alta Journal. And I will let them take it away.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, Ken. How are you?
I'm great. I have to start by saying I love SKYLIT, and I'm happy to be here virtually. So
I love SKYLIT too, and I love independent booksellers, and I just want to start by encouraging everybody listening to buy your books from independent booksellers. Do not buy your books from the behemoth if you can avoid it. Support local independent booksellers. They are the backbone and spine of American literary culture. So now that I've put in my little plug, let's get right into it. I mean, it's a really interesting book. What I really want to do is direct, because you do this sort of interesting structural move where you start chapters with an autobiographical kind of, like an example, and then you kind of use that to move into kind of the practicalities. One of the things that you address right at the outset, which actually seems to me to be a kind of line that moves throughout the whole book, is this question of how does one comport oneself as a director. You write about that in the first couple pages in the introduction of the book, and it seems to be the kind of driving notion, writing from the inside about what it means to wear the mantle. And I wonder if we can start by just sort of talking a little bit about that as a way of getting into some of the more specific issues that you raise in the book.
Sure. Well, I've been directing for about 37 years actually, and over the past few years I've been mentoring. I had the pleasure of mentoring several up-and-coming directors, and of course there's a lot of talk about craft, but working with young directors, what I discovered is what they most want to discuss is things that I never was taught in film school, and questions like, how do you comport yourself as a director? And what I mean by that is, how do you carry yourself, for instance, on a set? And so a lot of the topics that I explore include how to create an environment, a work environment where people feel respected and acknowledged, and how to assert authority without being authoritarian, and how to, I mean, again, I feel like it's a topic that extends beyond being a film director. I mean, if you're in any management position or any leadership position, I hope that you'll enjoy tales of me struggling to, sort of wrangle a sometimes unruly group of collaborators, trying to get a lot of people with different agendas on the same page. And so that's one of the things that inspired me to write the book, was just, again, young filmmakers asking me questions that to address things that I was never taught in film school, and that I had to learn on my feet, often by falling on my face.
Why do you think, I mean, I've noticed this too. We don't talk about these things that often in writing programs and writing classes too. Why do you think that that they aren't part of that kind of discussion? It feels to me that in some way it's not even just the craft of directing, it's kind of the people management collaborative aspect of directing or artistic work. It feels to me to be an absolutely essential aspect of it, but we kind of overlook it in favor of, let's say, the personal vision of the artist. I'm curious about that.
Well, some of it has to do with, a sense of how we look at the director as an artist. And I would say that, I mean, look at it, creating a good work environment is not on most film school syllabi. In fact, I would say it's often the opposite. It's that, if enshrined in film lore are nothing but, stories of, angry eruptions on the set, directors who work a crew to death to get a shot. And, and sadly, there are a lot of people in the industry who really believe that you get the best results out of your cast and crew by creating panic and chaos on the set. So I wasn't built that way, I'm happy to say. I don't know how to do that. I wouldn't want to do that. And so I disagree with that approach. And so, again, I feel like in my own small way, I'm sort of filling the gap, that occurs in film schools. I mean, I feel like there are many simple things that a person can do to simply, again, treat a crew respectfully. Like, this is going to sound so simple and almost like a joke, but learn people's names.
Yeah.
It's like, it's weird. I've been on sets where directors really have no clue and don't know the names of the people they're working with. And I mean, how hard is it really? Are you so preoccupied with your artistic vision that you can't learn the names of the people who are carrying it out? It's insane. But I have observed more than a few directors for whom the crew is basically invisible.
Now you go in the book, you talk, in addition to talking about kind of pragmatic, practical, work-related ideas, and also broader artistic ideas. I think there's a lot of sort of discussion of kind of visual iconography, and just to make sure I'm remembering the phrase exactly, you have that great chapter.
Oh, the objective correlative.
Thank you. That was the one I was looking for. The phrase that escapes my head. That great chapter on the objective correlative, which, it is so important in terms of, I mean, I want you to talk about that example, but it's so important in terms of how character is defined through a simple gesture that seems perhaps contradictory at first, but in fact ends up illuminating the complexity of a character. Let's talk about that, but I also want to jump into some of the practical and some of your own sort of background and movement through the art of directing as a career.
Well, the idea of the objective correlative, and the phrase comes from literary criticism. It doesn't come from filmmaking or film criticism. It was actually coined by T.S. Eliot, but it refers generally to the idea that the meaning of a story or the arc of a character or the subtext, the emotional subtext of a scene, can be conveyed through an object or a piece of wardrobe or even a space. And frankly, when I stumbled upon this phrase, I just thought it was kind of amazing, and it got me very excited to review films that I love, and also my own work, to see if I, consciously or not, sort of looked for ways to, sought to, find objective correlatives for instance, character dynamics or relationships. I'll give you one example that I trust that our listeners will know, and that's from the television show The Office. I directed the pilot of The Office, and one of my jobs was to figure out the layout of the set, the layout of the bullpen of the Dunder Mifflin Paper Company, specifically where people sat, who faced who. I mean, if you know the show, does Jim and Dwight, do they face each other? Do their desks face each other or not? Where do the accountants sit? Should people work in cubicles or should it be an open plan? All these questions were things that I was helping to answer. And one of the big questions had to do with Pam and Jim. And obviously their relationship, at least at the beginning of the series, is fraught. They obviously are attracted to each other, but she has a boyfriend. She is taken. She will shortly be engaged. So I actually thought very deliberately about how their desk arrangement could somehow tell the story of their relationship. And so what I came up with was the idea that Pam's reception desk always faces Jim, so she's always looking at him. Mm-hmm. But he, on the other hand, is sort of perpendicular to her. He's at a 90-degree angle to her. So in order for him to look at her, he must make an effort. He must turn to see her. It's a super simple thing, but it allowed me to create what I think was one of the signature images of the series at the beginning, and that's this idea of seeing Jim in profile in the foreground and Pam in the background sort of staring at him, with Jim either unaware that she's looking at him or pretending to be unaware that she's looking at him. But again, it's just the simple idea of how their chairs related became an objective correlative of their relationship.
Yeah, and it also generates a powerful dramatic tension. I've just been rereading the Marilyn Robinson novels, and because she's got a new novel coming out, and in Lila, the third novel, there's a knife that functions in that way as a kind of I don't know, it's a signifier, but in the sense that it carries so much metaphorical weight. It's not simply a knife. It's a birthright. And I think this, and again, a very simple kind of narrative choice. Now, when you got started, you tell the story in the book of your first camera when you were 10 years old and trying to set up a fancy shot on a pool table and knocking the camera off the table and having the camera get broken. It's a great way for it to direct. So to start ambitiously like that, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how, how you knew at 10, the sense of being seized by something like that at a young age, and kind of knowing that it was what you were going to want to, you couldn't have known it was going to be your career, but you did know it was something you were going to want to pursue.
I don't remember any specific point during my childhood where I decided I wanted to become a filmmaker, but I did, as a child, start to get a sense that there was somebody, pulling the strings, somebody behind the curtain, somebody who was telling the story. And I did find in my young days that I would not only spend my allowance on movies, but I would go to see movies 2 and 3 times. And my father in particular was just incensed. What a waste of money to see a movie twice, let alone a third time. And I actually remember I had a very big argument with him about this point when I insisted I had to see Arthur Penn's film Little Big Man, like for a 3rd or 4th time. I was just sort of so fascinated by it. And I think by then, this would have been 1968 or 9, probably 69. I was, very invested in the idea of being a picture storyteller.
When you say picture storyteller, you mean working in telling stories through a visual medium, or is there more to that then?
Yeah.
Right. What were the other, in addition to, was it, as far as Little Big Man, I love that movie. I'm curious about the draw. For me, it was Hoffman's performance, maybe primarily, or also the kind of fascination I had with the makeup and the aging process. I think that was the first time I must have been 10 or so when that movie came out. And it was the first time I had ever really paid attention to those kinds of elements of visual storytelling, that that you could use makeup and to really age a character, to really kind of hone a character, that it wasn't just about a character playing someone their own age.
Right. What struck me even when I was young about the film was actually its comic tone, and I love the idea that the entire film is about a highly unreliable narrator. Mm-hmm. Or told from the point of view of a highly unreliable narrator. I hadn't seen a story like that before. It seemed to be, on one hand, historical, and at the same time, every scene was fake. So it was like I was sort of fascinated by this strange tension, which was funny. And again, not having, I didn't know Thomas, is it Berger or Berger? Thomas
I
Berger's
believe
novel,
it's Berger.
It's novel, but I attributed a lot of the success of the, in terms of the style, in terms of the kind of slyness of the tone, to Arthur Penn. It's a great book.
Yeah, no, it's one of my favorites. I now just having this conversation makes me feel like I need to look it up and watch it again because it's been a long time.
And if I may, I then a couple of decades later, I had the pleasure of directing one of its stars, Faye Dunaway, co-starring with an orangutan. So.
I want to ask you. You actually start your first professional directing gig was TV, right? Was an ABC afternoons after school special, and then you moved into feature directing, and then you moved back into TV directing, and then kind of now have kind of gone back and forth. And I'm curious about that dynamic. We've talked in the past about the shift in the culture's perception of the balance or the relationship between features and television production, and how TV was once a stigma and now of course is no longer. For you, having worked over this long span of time going back and forth between the media, I'm curious about your thoughts on that relationship and
Oh yeah, I'd love to share with you a big turning point in my attitude towards TV versus film. I mean, I started directing in 1983 as a professional director, and at that time there was such a bias against TV directing among my peers and certainly my film school teachers. And I think that the general thought was, if you're a television director, like, good luck getting into features, and if you're a feature director, why would you possibly want to work in TV? And I definitely was among the people who held that bias. And I remember in the early 90s, it was actually early 92, I had just co-directed the feature film He Said, She Said with my now wife, Marissa Silver, and was struggling to get a new feature film off the ground when I was sent the script of a half-hour comedy pilot. And when I received it, my heart sank. I thought, if I take this job, this is like the slippery slope. No one will take me seriously as a feature director again. And I really didn't even want to open the manila envelope, but I did. And I read the title page, and it was the pilot of the Larry Sanders Show. And
you had been familiar with, you were familiar with It's Gary Shandling's show, which is
certainly
obviously a very different show, but it's kind of the precursor to that show.
Absolutely. Although it's Gary Shandling's show could not, they are completely opposite in approaches. And when I read the pilot of the Larry Sanders Show, I was astonished, because it not only felt more, by the way, Gary wrote it, and along with wonderful writer Dennis Klein. They were the co-authors of the pilot. And when I read it, it not only was so sharp and intelligent, sharper than, forget other shows, it was sharper than any movie playing in town that moment. It felt like it was, these people were kind of reinventing the game a little bit. But what really struck me is, again, tone. And the characters were such complicated people. And I literally remember reading the script thinking, am I supposed to like these people? And at the center of the ensemble, of course, is Gary's character, Larry Sanders, who is, frankly, at times thoroughly sort of a bit reprehensible. And I thought, wow, this is something I have not experienced before in a show. And so I jumped on it, and I'm happy to say that show is, now thought of as a harbinger of, the changes, in how people tell half-hour stories now. I'll just give you, just to trace the arc, from Larry Sanders to, shows like Fleabag or Atlanta, or a show that I worked on, and I'm very proud to say I worked on this. I worked on Tig Notaro's show, One Mississippi, which, again, it is a comedy, but it deals with such tough material. And Tig, has such a genius for finding humor in the most dire experiences. But that, I feel like all of that is part of the legacy of the Larry Sanders Show. So at that point in my career, it was like, you know what? All bets are off. And now, of course, everything's flipped. I mean, now you have people who make their first feature film in order to use it as a springboard to create series.
Right.
So,
And do you think, I mean, I know we've talked a little bit about this too, but what do you think the pandemic or the potential aftermath of the pandemic? I mean, of course, we don't know what that's going to look like, but certainly the pandemic has shut down production. Now production is kind of coming back. But looking, people are looking at kind of smaller bore productions, smaller casts, et cetera. There seems that there have been a number of kind of revolutions, some technological, some otherwise, that have changed the way we think about this. The development of, personal computer and, video editing software, the development of the high-res phone that you can shoot a feature on your phone now, which makes it much more accessible than when you had to buy 35 or 16 millimeter film stock. Now we're facing a situation where it's hard to get a big cast of people together. It's a weird question to ask because I'm asking you to prognosticate something that nobody knows the answer to. But if you were imagining it, where do you imagine things going in, let's say, the next 6-12 months?
I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to be a good prognosticator, but I will say what I'm worried about. Because I love both series and feature films. I love going to the theater. I love watching series at home. And my biggest concern is that when the pandemic is over, or whatever over means, that people will have fallen out of the habit of going to a movie theater. And I'm worried about long form narrative in general. And of course, there are obviously features that are made for the theaters that are now being debuted on streaming services. And that's fantastic. But I'm just, I was concerned already before the pandemic. And about certain genres in particular, I feel like studios, it seems, stopped making comedies. Yeah. Or they certainly stopped making romantic themed comedies. And I'm sensitive to that because I've directed a couple myself. On the plus side, I guess, is if you are given these new parameters. For instance, I've been on Zoom calls with producers and studio people who say, come up with stories that only involve 2 characters. Well, maybe there will be a proliferation of interesting, intimate, character-driven stories. Maybe we will see the emergence of a new Eric Romer.
Right, exactly. That which would be wonderful if that was the way it went. I'm curious. I mean, I'm curious about this in terms of who knows, but I agree with you. I think one of my concerns is the sort of the falling out of the habit of, for want of a better phrase, like the public spectacle or the public gathering, or the shared artistic experience, whether that be theater or concert or film, movie theater experience. And I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what people will be comfortable with.
It's very difficult to guess, but all I can say is even before the pandemic, I mean, things have changed so much. I mean, the idea of having to choose between whether to watch a film like The Irishman in a theater or on TV, or in many cases in the country, not having the choice. Yeah. And it's impossible for me to imagine not having the pleasure of watching a film like Roma on the screen.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to imagine not having the pleasure of being in a packed room full of people enjoying a hilarious film, Bridesmaids.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that collective experience, I agree with you. There's nothing quite like it. I want to go back to just for a second to Gary Shandling and Larry Sanders, because I think, you do this amazing bit at the very beginning of the chapter you write about him. You open the chapter with Shandling speaking, and I'll assume we're doing this for adults, so I can use his language. But I'm not an asshole, Gary Shandling insisted, but I have the potential. And what he's doing is he's talking from the point of view of Larry Sanders about what the kind of dramatic tension of the series is, right? That the center of it is this character who is, has as you said, has the potential to go off. But you also talk about how the real draw of the show, which is what I loved about it as a viewer, was that you're behind the scenes, that you're backstage. We all know what that talk show looks like from the other side of the screen, and we know what kind of role everybody's playing when the camera is rolling. But it's the seeing it from behind the scenes. And you cite this example where you were in the green room at the Tonight Show with Shandling before, sort of towards the end, before Carson retired. and Doc Severinsen walks in wearing a t-shirt, not wearing his trademark suit. You say is almost unrecognizable. And he's complaining about the coyotes that are, in his yard and how he wants to kill them all. And Shandling turns to you and goes, "That's the show, right? That's the show." And there's something so powerful about these people with polished images kind of dropping the facade and just being who they are. I thought that was just a great example of how the DNA of that show, I guess.
Well, part of it was the contrast between how people carry themselves in front of the camera and how they behave once the cameras are turned off. And that obviously gives the show a lot of energy. But there was also, the Doc Severinsen story also speaks to something that Gary was very interested in as a storyteller. And that was just sort of inconsequential, like ephemera, like the little, throwaway moments, that take place backstage, things that don't move the plot forward. Just, kind of throwaway comments. And he just loved the idea of not only the two of us getting to hear Doc Severinsen in an unexpurgated moment, but also that it was just sort of a non-consequential moment as well. But I do want to go back to I'm not an asshole, because the key that conversation took place during my job interview to get the job to direct the pilot episode of the Larry Sanders Show. And I asked Gary if he could give me a kind of I don't want to necessarily call it a mantra, but sort of, could he boil down the show to a sentence? Like, what is the overarching idea of this show? If I'm ever confused as a director, what can I kind of remind myself? What's the main idea here? And he thought about it, and he was very happy and excited to sort of think about how to boil down his new creation. And that's when he turned to me and said, "This show is about whether or not I'm going to become an asshole. I'm not an asshole, but I have the potential." And I remember in the moment thinking, who is he talking about?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. So, and as I write in the chapter, it was very quickly I realized that this sort of gray area between Gary and Larry was the real subject of that television show. And I think it's to me a uniquely personal show as a result.
No question. I mean, and this raises a couple of things. I mean, I do want to ask you a little bit about meetings, because you have that great chapter early in the book where you kind of go through the variety of kinds of meetings that you can have. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about, particularly in a series, right? Because in a feature, you're in a constrained temporal space. You're in a couple of hours. You're going to tell this whole story over the course of a couple of hours, or let's say 120-page screenplay. In the case of a series, and particularly a series like Larry Sanders, which goes on for a number of seasons, that narrative arc, such as it is really open-ended. You don't know when the show is going to end, and you want to be able to develop. You're not just doing a series of 30-minute episodes that exist in a kind of timeless landscape where there's not a progression from one episode to the next. So what are the, in terms of kind of the mechanics of developing that long form and open-ended narrative? I know you're working with a crew of writers and all of that, but I mean, the team, how is that different? What's it like to build that long open-ended narrative?
Well, I'm gonna switch gears only because I worked on the Larry Sanders Show for 2 seasons. I did 13 episodes. I think I did 13 episodes. But I didn't stay with it longer. But I'll just to switch gears to The Office for a second, because I helped launch the show, and then I came back at the end to direct the series finale of the show. And the one thing I did notice, the series finale is nearly 90 minutes long. And what I noticed is not so much about the different individual character arcs as I noticed that over time, secondary and tertiary characters became more and more popular, so that there were just more storylines. And everyone, and again, I think in a popular ensemble show, what often happens is people get more and more invested in I don't want to say minor, but I'll say secondary, tertiary characters, and as a result, I mean, it's wonderful, but I was so startled, coming back to the show after a while to see how fully developed those characters' storylines were. Characters who, by the way, in the pilot had no lines, had no character.
Right. And many cases, right, were not actors. I mean, had not been or not in many, but in some cases had not been professional actors. They just, they ended up sort of inhabiting and developing those roles.
Right.
But I would imagine that's also, for the writing staff, that gives them juice as well. I mean, you obviously aren't going to write to a character that nobody in the audience cares about, but it opens up the potential plot and character development aspects of the writing, because you're not just writing about the same 2 or 3 characters. You have a broader brush.
I'm going to credit Greg Daniels for one among many things that he did wonderfully, is that he made the choice to actually embed within the ensemble several writers.
Mm-hmm.
So B.J. Novak, Paul Lieberstein, Mindy Kaling play characters, but they are also key writers on the writing staff. So I think what happened, and you'd have to ask them more specifically, but my sense is that because they were interacting with the whole group right from the get-go, that again, smaller parts or parts with characters who had no name or dialogue suddenly grew more quickly than they might otherwise if a writing staff had been miles away in another office.
Yeah. No, I think the organic growth of it is, because it is one of the few shows that I think I watch pretty consistently throughout its run without kind of feeling that it was recycling itself or without getting bored. And it was a long run. I want to go back to the notion of meetings, because everybody I know, myself included, hates meetings. You break down, in the chapter on meetings, both in terms of necessity, you break down meetings in a really interesting way. The self-sabotage, or the kamikaze meeting, right? The one at the end where you talk about, the careful what you wish for, where you make an impassioned pitch, a really carefully constructed impassioned pitch for a project that you simply don't care about, and they say yes, and then you walk out of there going, oh God, now I have to do it. So I'm curious about, meetings are obviously a huge part of this. Nobody, as far as I know, teaches people how to comport themselves in a meeting. So it really is something that you learn by doing. Let's talk about kind of meetings, their pratfalls, their importance, and kind of what your tips are for people in terms of meetings.
Well, again, the chapter mainly focuses on bad meetings, actually. Yeah. And as I sort of do a breakdown of like horrible meetings that I've endured. And for instance, the kamikaze meeting is one that I define as a meeting where, halfway through you actually decide you don't want to do the project and announce that you don't want to do the project. And I've only done that once, but I was actually meeting at a studio to direct a studio feature, and in the middle of the meeting I said, you know what, I hate to say it, I'm the wrong person for this job.
And then they tried to convince, then they start pitching you, right?
Well, I weirdly enough, my being candid about that put them on the defensive, because they thought it was somehow a referendum on the project itself. They were suddenly pitching the project to me. But I would say that the 2 big tips, I guess the 2 big tips I'll mention right now is one is I often, when I'm going into a meeting, whether it's to get a job or to try and convince someone to spend money on a project, is I often think about what my perceived weakness is and hit it head on. And again, that I'll just repeat the example that I use in the book, and that is that when I interviewed with the producer of the film, The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, I led off by saying, I'm not a teenage girl.
Yeah.
And I'm not in the demographic that this film is probably aimed at. So right away, I just didn't want to beat around the bush. That's actually probably something that the person interviewing me was thinking about. Now, there's a longer answer about than what I did to make the producer feel comfortable and excited about me directing it. But I think the main thing is right from the get-go, I said, you probably are thinking this, and I'm acknowledging it.
Right.
And the other thing that has the next tip, and again, I may give this a little short shrift because it's we could have a whole discussion about this, but I actually think it's important in a meeting to occasionally be upfront about what you don't know. And I think not knowing or being unafraid of saying what you don't know can be a major strength in a lot of situations, in both on the set, but definitely in a meeting. And there's definitely been times where I was upfront with somebody about where I didn't have expertise, and it disarmed them, and in a positive way. And I'll mention just a brief, I interviewed with Jim Henson to direct the film Sesame Street Presents Follow That Bird. It was my first feature film. And at one point early in the meeting, I just was very candid. I said, I've never directed a puppet in my life. I have no idea how to direct a puppet. Yeah. And that could have been the end of the meeting. But I think he was so disarmed by the candor that he said, he goes, well, just think of puppeteers as actors. Talk to puppeteers like they were actors. And then we got involved in a discussion about effectively how do you direct a puppet. But that's an example where, again, being candid about what you don't know is a strength and a good tool in a meeting.
Yeah, it's funny, I always encourage students to do the same. Don't pretend you know everything. There's no shame in not knowing everything. And it can be disarming because interviewers are often they're so ready for the interview subject to have an answer to everything that when they see you being yourself and honest and unfiltered in that way, often you end up with a positive response. How does that work on the set? I mean, again, this comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning about the collaborative nature of production. One of the things I really admire about the book and completely agree with is the idea that you get good people to work with and then you let them do their job. You don't micromanage. You trust your people, you don't second guess. You have that great anecdote about, when you're in the editing room and, don't be like, you should have cast somebody else because this is what you've got. But in terms of building that collaborative team and kind of the trust that's necessary where they know you are sitting at the top of the pyramid as the director, but, your cinematographer, et cetera, like they know that they are free to kind of do their own creative work. What's the process of building? How does that process get built? And are there some examples of things where you've been presented with an alternative, let's say, during the middle of a production by someone that you hadn't thought of, but that you wanted to use?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I'll just talk about one example, and that is that, I feel like as a director, you don't need to be an expert at every craft. You don't need to be an expert at costume design. You don't need to know lenses. You don't need to know, how to light the scene. But your authority lies in the emotional content of the scene. You are the designated storyteller. So I sometimes feel like it's easy to trip up as a director by doing someone's job for them, telling a cinematographer what kind of lens to use, telling a costume designer something about their craft that you don't need to. What you need to do is represent the emotional content of the story precisely and let them translate it. And frankly, it's always going to get better results. Now, you may have a vision. Hopefully you do have a vision. But, it doesn't mean that you don't want to kind of activate people to not simply embrace your vision, but own it and kind of make it their own.
Yeah.
And so the way to do that is not to tell people what their job is. And again, there's 100 different examples, but I would just say that it's easier. And by the way, talking about costume design, I'm like the last person to talk about costume design. I don't know from clothes. Style is very foreign to me.
I share that with you.
I have a big closet full of T-shirts. But what I do feel comfortable saying to a costume designer is what's driving a particular character, what this character's outlook is, what are the circumstances that shape this character's life, and letting them run with that. And that's exciting. And I'm happier to let someone, why not energize your collaborators? So anyways, that's one of many examples of like how to start to build a sense of, again, not simply, collaboration, but to actually get people to really bring their A game.
Yeah. No. Now, apropos of collaboration, I would be remiss before we go if I didn't ask you about you've co-directed with your spouse. And so, I don't know that that's any different from co-directing with someone else, but I'm curious about that experience of that kind of level of collaboration. That's, that if you are the kind of, the designated storyteller as the director, and then there are two directors collaborating. Now that movie was a back and forth in a variety of ways, but just in terms of the sort of the sharing or the collaboration on the designated storyteller, how was that experience different or creatively, say, from a film in which you are the sole director?
Well, that film, He Said, She Said, is about two distinct points of view.
Yeah.
The two characters played by Kevin Bacon and Elizabeth Perkins. So you see essentially the same story told from each of their points of view. And Marissa and I wanted to also tell the story with two distinct directorial points of view. So in a way, part of our job as collaborators was to give each other some space to create our own visions for how to tell those stories. So that's very different than there are certainly a lot of co-directing teams who are on the set working on the same scene together. But when Marissa and I co-directed that film, just to give you one example, if I was working with the actors, Kevin and Elizabeth, Marissa would keep her distance, watch what I'm doing, but she would not talk to them. And when she stood up and did either her version of the same scene or a scene from Elizabeth's version of the story, I would lay back and watch what she was doing. And again, I think what was exciting about it was how we sort of surprised each other directorially. Mm-hmm. And her stuff is, her version is great. So.
Well, this has been really wonderful, Ken. Thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation, and good to talk with you.
Thank you, and again, thank you to SKYLIT for having us. I loved it.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was really lovely. Ken, big fan of all your films, of all your shows. So glad that we can talk about your book too. And David, of course, you're a dear friend of SKYLIT and a good pal of mine. And so just so happy to have you both. Just as a reminder, Ken's book, But What I Really Want to Do Is Direct, is available for purchase at SKYLIT Books. And of course, all of David's books as well are available for purchase. So you can do so online at skylitbooks.com. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you guys for joining us. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.
I see